Welcome back to this TRT World special on Turkey's operation in northern Syria. I'm Anelise Borges coming to you from Onjupinar, a border crossing between Syria and Turkey. Now, Turkey's Operation Olive Branch has somewhat divided members of the Kurdish community. TRT World met a man who decided to fight alongside the Free Syrian Army against the Kurdish YPG. This is a Kurdish soldier fighting against the Kurdish YPG. TRT World's Ahmed Al-Burai says that this man told him his story and decided to fight alongside Turkey after the YPG attacked his family. This is his story.
Ezadi Shapo is a Kurdish leader in the Free Syrian Army, but he's fighting against other Kurds. They belong to the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is dominated by the YPG terror group. Back in 2015, the YPG killed Ezadi's brother when they attacked their village. He says the YPG doesn't represent Syrian Kurds.
The YPG are no more than mercenaries. They and Daesh were used by the coalition to ban Aleppo and other provinces. I'll speak as a Kurd. If they claim they are the guarantors of the Kurdish nation, why do they still control Arab villages in Raqqa and Tel Rifat?
Not long ago, Daesh snipers shot up Ezadi's car. Now they're basically gone. But instead of Daesh, it's the YPG that is shooting at him.
As Kurds, we participated to the revolution because Assad saw us as slaves. But the YPG came along with their vicious agenda. Under the pretext of protecting the Kurds, they started recruiting children and women to their party, which is just the branch of the PKK. So we had to fight them.
Ezadi says he joined the opposition for what he calls dignity, hope, and freedom. And even though the people he is shooting at now are Kurds like him, he says he is prepared to see this war through to the end. Ahmed Al-Burai, TRT World, Azaz, Syria.
I want to go live now to Istanbul, where we're going to be joined by Yusuf Erim. Yusuf, tell us more about this, which is a very interesting element in this operation. What's been the reaction among members of the Kurdish community here in Turkey, but also inside Syria?
Well, there's different reactions from the Kurdish community in Turkey, depending on the region. Now, in the southeast of Turkey, we've seen some protests and we've seen the Kurdish community have some concerns, but this was to be expected because there's a heavy, not a heavy, but a moderate PKK element in that region, and that's the region that they would consider their home base of operations in Turkey. Now, when we go to the metropolises like Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir, we see a much more muted reaction where there's just some light concerns, but we haven't seen many protests or anything like that. So it's basically a relax. There's the general feeling in the metropolis is that there's a support for the Turkish army and support for Operation Olive Branch. Now, when we go to the Kurds in the Syrian region, especially in Afrin, we see some of the Kurds are actually fed up with the YPG rule because the YPG in reality is an occupying force. They've been in the Afrin region since 2012. And before this, the Kurds living in this region had been living in harmony with the Sunni Arabs and the Turkmens also there. Many of the Syrian Kurds in the Afrin region are also fed up because some of the YPG's tactics that they use, especially in recruiting child soldiers. This has been a matter of contention. This has been a matter that has sparked a lot of outrage in the Kurdish communities in Afrin.
Indeed, Yusuf, this is a very interesting element of this story. Turkey, I want to bring it back to Turkey because Turkey is a multicultural country. In your opinion, in the long term, what kind of impact can Operation Olive Branch have in Turkey? And overall, is there popular support for this military incursion inside Syria?
Well, amongst the Turks, there's it's incredible support. We see all three the major political parties, the ruling AK Party, the major opposition, CHP, and the minor opposition, MHP, all support the operation. We see the public support the operation. And the operation is definitely important to the future of Turkey because once Turkey can secure its borders, it can sever the PKK from the YPG in the south and isolate and shift its concentration back onto fighting the PKK. Also, there's 3.5 to 4 million refugees living in Turkey. Now, these refugees have come with a $30 billion price tag. Turkey needs to help these refugees come back home. But in order for them to come back home, the Turkish army needs to secure their homes and provide a safe environment where they can go back home and become part of a new Syria.
Yusuf, live for us in Istanbul. Thank you very much for this analysis. Now, as often happens, as often is the case in war zones, the ones that suffer the most tend to be the civilians who end up caught in conflicts. Turkish troops have recently come across several people needing help inside northern Syria. They recently rescued a disabled woman that needed to be transferred to a health facility here in Turkey. TRT World's Nafisa Latic reports.
Nobody knows her name, her age, or her family. But here, they call her Afrin. That's where she was found. In northwestern Syria, in her house, after her village was captured by Turkish soldiers. No one knows how long she was left on her own.
We took her into the center and washed her because she smelled so bad. She was staying in a house that was full of garbage.
Since then, workers at this rehabilitation center in southern Turkey have been feeding her and helping her recover. It's been a long journey for Afrin. The woman was initially brought to a first aid tent belonging to the Turkish army that was set up on the border. Then she was transferred to a state hospital in Hatay and then brought to here, to this rehabilitation center.
Until Afrin's family returns, she is under state protection and she will receive all the care she needs. This is her home now.
The center says it will try to find her family, but it's not clear how it can. Until then, Afrin is surrounded by friendly faces, and her caretakers already see a change.
Today she woke up happier and watched TV. She played with the children and we tried to talk with her because we didn't know if she can speak or not.
Afrin may never find her family, but for now, she has a new beginning and a new name. Nafisa Latic, TRT World, Hatay, Turkey.
And as we speak to you here from the Onjupinar crossing on the Turkish-Syrian border, we keep hearing artillery firing. This is a very much ongoing operation. And I want to bring in now Courtney Kelly, who's live for us in Kilis. Courtney, I want to know more about how civilians are living this operation. We've been talking about how civilians have been impacted. How are people describing the situation they find themselves in Kilis? We seem to have lost connection with Courtney Kelly. We will be joining her in a few moments' time. Let's go back to Yusuf Erim, who is in Istanbul. Yusuf, I want to bring you back to the discussion now, just to try to get a bigger sense in terms of the civilian factor here. Turkey has repeatedly said that it's trying its utmost to avoid casualties on the civilian side, or at least trying to minimize that as much as possible. This is a military operation, it's a war. What is being done, or at least what is being said that is being done in terms of the protections that are being taken by Turkish troops, by the Turkish military in northern Syria?
Well, the Turkish Armed Forces is a unit that's always been very, very sensitive to the humanitarian side. They're being very careful when conducting airstrikes. And there's also a lot of NGOs that are moving in unison with the Turkish Armed Forces. So when they're entering into Afrin, they're entering in with these NGOs who are also helping.
So they are indeed trying to get these measures applied to the battlefield. I want to bring Courtney Kelly back now, live from Kilis. Courtney, can you hear us now? And no, we don't have Courtney right now. Let's move on now to the diplomacy. There's been concern that Turkey's operation inside Syria could hinder diplomatic efforts. We're talking about a 7-year war that has been devastating lives, devastating people, killed more than a couple 100,000 people in Syria. Millions have been displaced. And of course, the diplomatic efforts continue, but there was concern that Turkey's incursion inside Syria could hinder that process. The military says hundreds of terrorists have been neutralized and that the operation is achieving desired objectives, but away from the battleground, there is another active front, the diplomatic front. TRT World's political correspondent Hassan Abdullah reports from Turkey's capital, Ankara.
Breaking up what Turkey calls the corridor of terror, a region stretching from northwest to northeast of Syria. PKK terrorist organization's Syrian branch, the YPG, has been targeting Turkey over the border. Over 700 attacks in the last few years. Along with Turkey, the United States and the European Union recognize PKK as a terrorist organization. It has killed over 40,000 people in Turkey in 3 decades. With Operation Olive Branch, Turkey seeks to deal with PKK, PYD and also Daesh. Before launching the operation, Turkey approached the stakeholders, including the Assad regime. Russia pulled its forces out of Afrin, paving the way for Turkey, but it called on all sides to exercise restraint. The United States, which is providing arms and training to YPG in the fight against Daesh, called on Turkey to avoid an escalation. Iran asked for an immediate end to the operation, and the European Union expressed some concerns.
Military activities from others in Syria can undermine seriously the resumption of talks in Geneva.
Ankara says such concerns are misplaced. It says it has played a key role in de-escalating the Syrian crisis and that some of its allies have blood on their hands. French President Emmanuel Macron says Turkey's operation should not become an excuse to invade a country. That comment did not go down well here.
Sizin tarihiniz işgallerle dolu.
Your history is full of invasions and exploitation. We have no such history. We have a history of justice and mercy. We have grown up with these values and we continue with them.
NATO's deputy chief has supported the Turkish position.
We always say that Turkey lives in a very tough neighborhood and that you have a legitimate right to take care of your own security. You have a legitimate need to take care of your own security as well on behalf of all the Turkish people.
The leadership here maintains that during Operation Euphrates Shield, Turkey had already cleared at least 2,000 square kilometers from Daesh terrorists and will push into Manbij after dealing with the threat in Afrin. Ankara has called on the US to withdraw its forces from Manbij. President Erdogan says the US should stop supporting terrorists. Failing that, he says, Americans would only have themselves to blame if they suffer casualties as they work with YPG terrorists on the ground.
For more on the diplomatic aspect of this operation, I'm going to be joined by Hassan Abdullah in Ankara, John Brain in Washington, D.C., and Dan Ashby in Moscow. Let's cross first now to Hassan Abdullah in Turkey's capital. Hassan, tell us more about the international reaction to Operation Olive Branch.
Well, Turkey is expecting its allies to understand its security concerns. Now, the United States, that continues to openly support the YPG terrorists, has called on Turkey to limit the scope of this operation and also define a time frame. Officials in Ankara have criticized this. They are saying that the United States, that has been stuck in a mess in Afghanistan for nearly 17 years, is asking Turkey to define a time frame when it's aware of the complexities. Then then there has been, of course, a response from Russia. Russia has pulled out its troops from Afrin, but it's also called on Turkey and the other side to ensure that there is no escalation. Iran is calling for an end to this operation. We've heard earlier the comment from the French president. He's basically said that he hopes that this does not turn into an invasion. Now, Turkish Prime Minister Binali Yildirim has responded to that. He said that, first of all, the objectives of Turkey are very clear. Turkey has already cleared over 2,000 square kilometers of area from terrorists, from Daesh in northern Syria. And this is precisely the objective in this case, clearing the area from other terrorists, the YPG and their allies. We've also heard the criticism from President Erdogan. He said that it's not Turkey that has a history of colonizing, but rather those who are criticizing Turkey are the ones who have engaged in colonization and enslavement of people. Now, Turkey also informed the Assad regime before starting this operation. Now, initially, there was no response from the Assad regime, but later on, they criticized and they said that they would target Turkish forces if Turkish forces were to enter a certain area. What officials in Ankara are saying is that it's quite clear that the Assad regime is allowing reinforcements to reach YPG terrorists, and diplomatically Ankara is saying that that could pose a challenge.
Now, Hassan, how can this develop in the long term? What kind of long-term impact could Operation Olive Branch and perhaps an extension of this operation into Manbij have on relations between Turkey and its allies?
Well, it could certainly have an impact on relations, particularly when we're talking about the United States. Turkey has repeatedly said that the United States needs to review its policy. Initially, there had been some assurances from Washington, and there was some indication here in Ankara that the Trump administration is going to move away from the broken promises and policies of the Obama era. But the position in Ankara now is that it's quite clear that in Washington, those Obama policies continue. And Turkey is saying that if the United States insists on supporting the terrorists, then first of all, that's a violation of the NATO Charter, the very notion of collective security, collective defense, where if one ally is attacked, then all allies are expected, all members of NATO are expected to defend that ally. That Ankara is saying is clearly not the case, so that could have an impact on not just Turkey-US relations, but relations between Turkey and NATO. And then also Turkey is pointing out that a number of Western European countries continue to allow PKK terrorists and their allies to engage in recruitment, fundraising and other activities in Western capitals.
I want to bring in now John Brain, who's standing by for us in the U.S. capital, Washington, D.C. John, what has the United States been talking about all this since, of course, the U.S. and Turkey, if we take a step back, seem to agree on their strategy here in Syria? They supported regime change. They wanted to see Assad go. They both largely supported the rebels, but they don't seem to agree on this enemy now. Tell us more about the United States' reaction to Operation Olive Branch.
Well, you're right, Anelise. Their actual long-term aims in Syria are extremely compatible. But the US is finding itself in a very uncomfortable position at the moment between a valued NATO ally on one hand and the main proxy that it's been using or sponsoring to fight the war against Daesh on the other. And that's why you're hearing the Rex Tillerson, the State Secretary, making this rather tricky balancing act, talking about recognizing Turkey's legitimate security concerns on one hand, and also calling on Turkey not to escalate the situation. I think it's important to point out that America doesn't always speak with one voice, and that's part of the problem in this, I think. The idea to create a 30,000-strong border force, for example, was something decided on by the Pentagon. It actually caught the State Department by surprise, much as when Donald Trump said that America would stop arming the YPG. That caught the Pentagon by surprise. So there is this misunderstanding, Turkey perhaps not recognizing that the US is speaking sometimes with multiple and sometimes contradictory voices. And I think from Washington perhaps not fully understanding that Turkey sees the YPG on its borders as being posing an existential threat.
Now, this project to create a 30,000 force was actually what prompted Turkey to initiate Operation Olive Branch. Now, what happens next, especially if Turkey decides to continue to move forward and, as promised, perhaps even open a new front in Manbij? What is likely to happen in Washington?
Well, that would certainly raise the tensions to another level entirely. There are no American troops, as far as we're aware, in Afrin. The Americans haven't worked closely with the YPG there. It's a different situation in Manbij. There are up to 2,000 American troops in that area, we're told, and they have been working closely with the US. Now, no one's suggesting that there are going to be any clashes between NATO troops and Turkish troops. These are two NATO allies, after all. But the commander of US Central Command has rejected the calls to pull American troops back from Manbij if Turkey goes in. He said that's just not going to happen. And the big fear is for some sort of accident, a stray missile, for example, which could kill American troops. If that happens, then this would be a fully fledged diplomatic crisis.
All right, John Brain live for us in Washington, D.C. I want to thank you for now. And I want to bring Dan Ashby, who's standing by for us in Moscow. Dan, now we're talking about the other side of the spectrum. Russia has been supporting Bashar al-Assad in this conflict. Russia certainly doesn't agree with most of what Turkey and the U.S. think is the best outcome in this war. What's been the reaction from Moscow with regards to Operation Olive Branch?
Well, the interesting thing from Moscow is not what Russia has said, but what they haven't said. There still has been no strong criticism, no strong condemnation coming out of Moscow. There has been that statement of concern that you mentioned earlier, where they called on all sides to exercise restraint. But many people saw that as quite moderate and effectively giving a green light to Turkey, particularly when you consider that Russian troops were withdrawn out of the area. What we do know that Russia is doing is again and again emphasizing territorial integrity. Recently, there has been releases on state media here saying that President Putin and Erdogan are talking. There obviously is some level of cooperation, and both have emphasized that integrity. Both have also emphasized the importance of Turkish-Russian positive relations. But there are two important aspects of this from the Russian perspective. The first is that as soon as this military operation began, they used it to effectively criticize the US, saying, well, look, the US security policy is making a mess in Syria, provoke this sort of action. And the second thing is they once again they want Turkey to be part of the Sochi peace dialogue. So they say that these relations are important. They want to keep Turkey on side because their vision for Syria, these peace talks, are most important to them.
All right. I want to thank you, Dan Ashby, live for us in Moscow. I also want to thank John Brain in Washington, D.C., and Hassan Abdullah, who was live for us in Ankara, Turkey's capital. I have one final question, if you will, for you, Onur Omer, political analyst and advisor. Thank you again for joining us here for this special edition on TRT World. What next for Operation Olive Branch?
Well, Operation Olive Branch will come to an end. I don't think it will happen immediately, as we discussed before, due to two major reasons. One, Turkey wants to secure everything to its fine tune as it moves along, and also to make sure to keep the civilian casualties at a minimal level. So if this means another 2 weeks or 2 months, I don't know. That's a better question for a military expert. But it will come to an end, and in the meantime, everybody should hope for, because that's what Turkey hopes for, that the major forces in the region, especially U.S., who has been arming, training, funding the YPG PKK, will come to its senses and make sure Turkey does not need to move beyond Afrin to secure its borders, to secure its cities.
So you are certain that Turkey will retreat its troops once that region here in Afrin is secured, once the situation is stabilized?
That's what the president has been saying from day one. He is just a couple of days ago, he said, we're there to make sure the area is secure, it's livable, that it's in a humane condition. That is all. We're not there to stay. If Turkey was there to stay, actions would have been different. The situation would have been different. But Turkey has not been known since the first days of its republic to be a country that will go somewhere, stay for other reasons than peace, than its own security.
All right, I want to thank you, Onur Omer, political analyst and advisor, for joining us here on TRT World for this special edition on Operation Olive Branch. That's it from me here on Jupinar crossing on the Turkish-Syrian border. But there's much more to come. Of course, Operation Olive Branch continues in northern Syria. Turkey's attempt to remove the YPG, which Ankara considers an offshoot of the PKK terror group, from its borders. So stay tuned to TRT World for updates from the front line, but also for international reaction on this operation. Thanks for watching. Stay with us.